Hello and welcome wherever you may be viewing from. Thank you for joining us for this conversation about the industries that could build Africa's economic future. Now, whenever we talk about industrialization in Africa, examples of successful Asian growth strategies often come up, which is understandable. After all, China designed and executed a policy that shrank the industrialization process to a mere 25 years, a process that many economies took at least a century to do. Well, over the last few years, many African countries have pursued policies sometimes designed to mimic the paths that Asian countries took. Despite these efforts, though, the industry's average contribution to continental GDP per capita remains flat at around $700 US dollars, that is. So, as robotics and AI advance and global value chains reconfigure to keep more production processes within nations, it's becoming clear that not all the things that worked for Asia will work for Africa. So, what are the policies that will provide African countries with successful paths to industrialization? And have the disruptions of the COVID crisis revealed opportunities for governments and private corporations to build a truly African industrial policy that leverages not just the digital revolution, but also regional comparative advantages? Those are some of the key questions we'll be exploring today. And before we go to our panel, we have the privilege of having in this session a seasoned economist to set the stage with some insights that will ground the rest of our discussion with some cold, hard facts. So I'm pleased to invite now Dr. Albert Zufak to lay some groundwork for us. Dr. Zufak is from Cameroon. His main research interest is in the micro foundations of macroeconomics, and he's currently the World Bank's chief economist for Africa. We're very glad to have you opening the session with your insights, Dr. Zufak. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. It's an honor and privilege to share this panel with all of you. It's a great privilege to speak at this extremely important forum. I'll start by making a simple point, which is from the research we have done, it's clear that Africa is not beyond industrialization. And it's actually quite critical to notice that the narrative about industrialization in Africa has become extremely confusing. And if you check the headlines of some of the most popular media, and I've looked at the Economist, for example, what is quite clear is between 2014, when they declare arrested development, basically in indicating that the path to development through industrialization was on its way out, to now, last April or last March, they actually published a headline saying African industry is doing great. African countries are actually doing better than anticipated. Well, you know, I like the Economist because, of course, when facts change, we must change our minds. Nevertheless, it can be very confusing. So this narrative is confusing essentially because there's very, very little empirical evidence to most of the claims that we hear about industrialization in Africa. One of the most important one is that Africa is deindustrializing. When research is done, it's actually not that clear. Africa actually has been creating more jobs in manufacturing in the last 10 years. And it's not clear that actually we are, manufacturing is leaving Africa at a high level of income, which is lower than the preceding economies that industrialized. Second is the notion that automation and digitalization will destroy jobs and therefore make manufacturing obsolete or not a path to development. There too, there is no evidence to support that. To the contrary, the World Development Report of the World Bank clearly showed that those claims were exaggerated, and recent research we've done shows that digitalization is actually creating jobs in Africa, not destroying them, and that's actually very, very important. Third is this notion that integrating global value chain is becoming difficult or if not impossible for African countries. Yes and no. Yes, because COVID has actually shown that global value chains can be disrupted by exogenous shocks. And this has clearly called in question a model that would just be relying on global value chain. But the good news here is that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is actually providing opportunities for regional value chains that would clearly provide stepping stones to new global chains as well. The last claim is that Africa is losing its wage competitiveness. There too, there is evidence that wages have been increasing in Africa, and that's not a very bad news. We need to acknowledge that. But if you compare, labor costs between China and Africa, they have been rising faster in China. So overall, those relative labor unit costs have been declining. Now, what I just told you is actually out of a study that my office has just completed that will be published on November 20th, which is the UN Africa's Industrialization Day. And the main message here is that industrialization remains a viable path for some countries in Africa where the policy environment is right. And this is very important because if you are running overvaluated exchange rate, definitely it's going to be very difficult to embark on an export-led growth model for industrialization, which is the advised path. Then, more importantly and more generally, this book is clearly suggesting that the idea that Africa has missed the manufacturing trend and should deliberately choose to skip this step altogether, it's mistaken, if not misleading. And this is very, very important. And COVID has actually proven that Africa cannot skip manufacturing altogether. COVID has really dealt a big blow to African economies, plunging Africa in a recession, 2% contraction in 2020. Our exports declined by 8%, our imports by 9%. FDI flows, even more importantly, FDI flows declined between 25 and 40%. This has put a lot of jobs at risk, and jobs in the formal and informal sector. But COVID has also brought a good news, which is this prospects for industrialization. We have seen countries actually repurposing their manufacturing sectors to produce PPE. We've seen countries and now making it clear that manufacturing pharmaceuticals, manufacturing vaccines is now a reality. And more importantly, we have seen access to digital technologies increasing and therefore laying the ground for future industrialization and future productivity growth in Africa. Now, what should we do? Three things, and I'll close on that. Three things that we should do. The first is to leverage the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, because manufacturing will be key to success. Recent studies we have conducted have shown that most of the gains from the Africa Continental Free Trade Area would come from an expansion of manufacturing, especially riding on regional value chains. And there are opportunities for regional value chains in Africa. One simple example is Togo and Nigeria, Togo exporting processed phosphates to Nigeria to manufacture fertilizers that would then be exported across the Africa region. Those opportunities exist for regional value chains, also in agro-processing, in automotive, in electronics, in garments, in pharmaceuticals. Those opportunities for African regional value chains do exist. There's a key role here to be played by the private sector. Now, second thing that we need to do is to seize the opportunities in the global decarbonization process that is ongoing and digitization. Decarbonization is an opportunity for African countries to ramp up investment in climate smart infrastructure, especially in our cities where these productive jobs will be created. It's also important to embrace green manufacturing, basically processing the minerals that will power the green economy of tomorrow. we do have all those minerals in Africa that would be helpful to produce batteries, produce solar panels, produce all those important important goods for the green economy. The other important opportunity for manufacturing is what I call manufacturing the things for the Internet of Things. Well, before we get to the Internet of Things, we need things. That fridge that will be able to connect with the computer needs to be manufactured. So it is important that Africa seizes this opportunity to position to produce the things for the Internet of Things. And then finally, you have all the advanced digital production technologies that are opportunities for us to also position for industrialization. Finally, the policy mix has to be right. We cannot industrialize when the macroeconomy is completely out of line, when we have exchange rate that cannot be competitive, when we have no fiscal space to produce or to create the infrastructure that the private sector needs. And in fact, countries need to raise more revenue, and the private sector has to pay its fair share of taxes as well if governments are to produce or generate that infrastructure. And the second thing in terms of policy is indeed to invest in these cross-cutting enablers of industrialization, mostly electricity, the digital, and cities connectivity. Third thing, important policy aspect is to facilitate entry and growth of young firms. Our research shows that it's not the large and old firms that are creating most of the jobs in Africa, it's the young firms. So we need to also, on the regulatory aspect, eliminate non-tariff barriers, which are the real block to Africa, intra-Africa trade. We also need to make sure that our fiscal incentives are realigned to support firms that are engaging in value addition and export, not import substitution, because that's the big difference between Asia and Africa. We've gone in the industrialization in the 70s on an import substitution basis. Asia took the export orientation, and that's why they went far ahead. So we need to also invest in technical skills, and this should be through the formal technical education, but also through employer-provided training. Training in African firms is the lowest in the world. Firms have to play their part. The private sector has to play its part. And finally, both governments and firms need to think Africa first. Ladies and gentlemen, if we do this, then the claim by the AU Vision 2063 may not be an empty one. Africa may be able to industrialize, and we may be able to produce the jobs that our youth needs so desperately. Thank you very much.
Dr. Albert Zufak, thank you so much. He is the World Bank's chief economist. That's a fantastic overview you've given us there. And I'm really looking forward to zooming into some of the details with our panelists, who I will quickly introduce now. We are delighted to have with us Honorable Betty Maina, Cabinet Secretary of the Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Enterprise Development in Kenya. She has a wealth of experience in trade and industry, having previously served as the Chief Executive of the Kenya Association of Manufacturers for 11 years. Welcome. We're also very pleased to have Ms. Maria Shaw-Barragan, Director of Lending in Africa, Caribbean, Pacific, Asia, and Latin America at the European Investment Bank, which of course is the lending arm of the European Union and the world's largest multilateral lender. Acha Leke is here with us today, a fantastic addition to our panel. Acha is Senior Partner and Chairman of McKinsey's Africa region. Acha advises governments, multinationals, and private sector institutions across Africa on a wide range of issues related to investment and economic development. And finally, we're also very lucky to have with us today Jean-Claude Lasserre, CEO Africa at Saint-Gobain. Jean-Claude oversees operations in 12 countries with 18 manufacturing facilities within Africa. Saint-Gobain is a leading producer of building materials present in 70 countries with 167,000 employees. So well-rounded panel, and thank you to all of you for joining us. Let's start with you, Honorable Minor. We've heard there a macro view from Dr. Zufak, and he's talked about a confusing narrative around the continent. It's something that the pandemic has likely exacerbated. Perhaps you can clear some of that noise for us and give us your perspective from where you sit at the center of one of the more progressive countries on the continent when it comes to industrial policy. How would you describe the narrative of Kenya's industrialization journey at the moment, and then Africa's as well, from your perspective?
Thank you very much, Nancy, and good to see all of you. Actually, it's good to see you after a very long time from our WEF Africa days, and but I keep in touch with your teams here. Now, I actually like some of the stuff that Albert has said, because it's very easy once, Africa's share of manufacturing output is really less than 2% of the global, when we think about it in global terms. And sometimes it appears as if Africa is deindustrializing, but a closer look at the numbers shows that you still have an increase in manufacturing output in several countries, certainly speaking for my own and the neighboring countries. I think the number that we often get confused by is the fact that other sectors are also growing rapidly, especially the services sector. But that does not take away from the fact that we're actually seeing an increase in manufacturing output, and there's lots more opportunities ahead of us. Albert referred to part of what we've just seen in the context of COVID-19, is that Africa is now, Kenya definitely, but Africa is now ramping up capacity for meeting critical critical supplies like in pharmaceuticals, vaccines, PPEs, and there's greater opportunity for that.
While you're just on that point, has the global pandemic actually had an impact on the direction of the industrial policies of Kenya or the continent, from your perspective?
Thank you. Actually, what it has done, it has the disruptions in global supply chains last year, and that continue to date, like with the ongoing container crisis, has really brought to the fore the need to be much more self-sufficient in some critical supplies. I have only just mentioned the matter of medical and medical commodities, but that's just one of them. But I think many countries have looked inwards, and the pharmaceutical action plan for Africa is now more urgent than ever. So that's been a good thing. The other thing about the pandemic is the need to further exploit internal industrial capacity. This is anecdotal, but I spoke to a furniture manufacturer in Kenya who increased their capacity, their output by more than 25% in 2020, because the customers who are used to high-end products did not have access to those, and discovered that they were actually locally available. So, and I think that's part of what we are experiencing in our country and the rest of the region, that we can trust our products better, and we don't have to import a lot of these commodities.
Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic point you mentioned there about that pivot inwards, born by necessity, but perhaps that's a trend that should continue. Maria, if I can come to you, of course, these industrial policies need capital to make them happen. When you survey the landscape, multilateral banks have been investing in Africa for years, but some would question whether these investments have yielded the best returns. Now, last year, your bank provided 5 billion euros for new private and public investment across Africa, which was the largest engagement in 55 years, I think, of operations on the continent. What's driving those commitments, and how does Africa's industrialization agenda fit in with the EIB's investment goals?
Thanks for having me here today in this fantastic panel.
I'm sorry, Maria. I think we're having trouble with your sound. Could I just ask you to just check that your connections are all working all right?
How is it now? Is it better?
I think that's better. Let's give it another go.
Okay, we'll go for it. Well, I had just thanked you for having me in the panel, so you didn't miss much. I was going to come to your point precisely to what has changed, what has been evolution.
I think we're still having trouble, unfortunately. It's on and off. Perhaps the technical team can help us sort that out while I go to someone else. I'm very sorry about that, Maria. Let's perhaps connecting and reconnecting will help, but we'll come back to you in just a moment. While we get you back, let's come to you, Acha, because you've argued that the large investments made by companies around the continent, whether it's Dangote Group or Boer Group, or the decision by US auto giant Ford to pour money into South Africa, proves that there is life yet in the manufacturing industry on the continent. That's a message we've heard both from Honorable Minor and from Albert a little earlier. But at the same time, that number is still there. Manufacturing in Africa has grown at just 2.5% over the past 20 years, compared to China and other countries like Vietnam, where it's between 15% and 20%. So is it time to look at a different model? Is there necessity for that, Acha?
I mean, so thanks for that, Nancy. I think that's a fundamental question. And maybe we start with maybe a few more numbers, right, to give you a sense, because I think talk about where we're going, we should think about where we are today. And we have done some work complementing some of the work Albert had done, looking at how much do we actually manufacture in Africa today? There's a question, right? We couldn't figure it out. So we did a bottom-up analysis. And we found that we manufacture about $500 billion worth of products in Africa today. About 70% of that is manufactured in a country and is actually consumed in that country. About 15 to 20% is manufactured in country and exported to the rest of Africa. So that's sort of the intra-Africa trade. And the rest is manufactured and exported to the rest of the world. So that's still quite small. Secondly, to your point, we actually think there's huge opportunity to scale that, right? We think you can go from 500 billion to $1 trillion, so an incremental 500 billion. But that 75% of that incremental capacity is to fulfill local demand because of the huge consumer demand we've been seeing even before COVID and even through COVID now coming out of the continent. So huge opportunity. But to your point, the sector has struggled, right? You gave some examples. The sector has grown at 2.5% for the last 15 years, is basically at global average, whereas you give the numbers for China and Vietnam at 13.5%, 15%. So something has to give. Now, why is this important? First, first for jobs. We know jobs is one of the biggest issues we face on the continent today. And you mentioned the Dangote Group. Aliko always reminds us that when you import a product, you're actually exporting jobs because that product is made in some other country, right? You're exporting jobs. So it's very important for us to produce more locally. Secondly, is for self-sufficiency. And we learned that the hard way through COVID. Right? You name it. You started with ventilators when all of our countries were looking for ventilators and we're being squeezed out of the market because, the developed markets were paying much more for it and we couldn't get it. Then it was test kits. Same thing. We tried to find test kits and everybody else was buying them. We got squeezed out. Then we came products. Senegal will tell you how they struggled to even import rice during the crisis because the global supply chains were disrupted. And now we're talking about vaccines. We're doing a lot of work in this space. And it's interesting to note, I was sitting with one of our African presidents who told me how him and the country had actually purchased 500,000 doses of vaccines from the Serum Institute, paid them, and then India banned export. So they couldn't receive the doses. And the reason it's an issue is because, you know, of all the vaccines in the world, 25% of them are administered in Africa, but we produce less than 1% of vaccines, right? So it's for self-sufficiency reasons, for jobs reasons, but also because we actually have a lot of the raw material. We have a lot of what it takes, right? We have the labor force. We're going to have the largest labor force in the world, larger than China and India's, as you know. We have competitive labor force. You know, Albert just gave us the numbers about how, you know, even though wages are growing, they're not growing faster than in other regions. We have some of the raw materials. So you have all of this together. But to your point, it's not working. I think we need to be honest with ourselves and say it's not working. The good news, though, is that, you know, everybody's now aligned. You know, through the crisis, we realize everybody's aligned to say we have to produce more on the continent. For all these reasons, we have to produce more. Governments are aligned in that. You know, we heard Honorable Maina talk about that. The private sector is aligned on that. And our development partners are all aligned on that, right? And so the question there is, what's it going to take? Right? And Albert has given us a few thoughts. I'll share probably just two and then close and have to, in addition to what Albert has shared. One is scale. Right, the continent, we're 54, 55 countries. You know, every country is just too small. When we looked at the vaccines, to really do it meaningfully, you need to have enough scale. There's, you know, very few countries where just building a plant to sell into that country will be enough, right? You need to have, you know, a regional scale, and that's why the CFTA comes into play to help us build that scale on the continent. So that's fundamentally important. The second is a regional industrial strategies. You know, every country is trying to do their own thing. We see in vaccines now, every country, we have 17 countries who've come and said we want to produce vaccines. Now, the reality is, if 17 countries do it, most of them will be uncompetitive, right? So how do we come together and do what Albert talked about, Togo and Nigeria, and say, okay, fine, for this region, you will produce this as a country. These inputs will come from these other countries. So we really try to do it together versus all of us competing for that same pie, right? So I think the regional strategies will be absolutely critically important as we go down this path, in addition to scale. And the final point I would say is competitiveness, right? I heard, Albert, you talked about, you know, let's focus on you know, global value chains and not on import substitution. I think it has to be both, actually. I don't think it's either or. But what we cannot do is just try to be uncompetitive globally and sort of protect these industries for long times on the continent, because that's not going to be the answer. So as we go down this journey, we need to figure out where is the competitiveness going to come from, and which industries would it make sense to actually for us to focus on versus which ones where, you know, we're late in the game, it just doesn't make sense for us to focus on. So those would be a few points I'd add to the mix to get us started. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic points there, and many we'll have to come back to, because there are tensions within what you talk about that almost makes it sound like countries have to export and import, and you know, there are tensions in terms of what to focus on, and we'll come back to that. But I hope we've got your sound now, Maria, because it's very important that we hear everything that you have to say. And I'd like to come back to you because Acha was talking there about alignment, and it's important for industrial policy within nations to be aligned both with the private sector, with multilateral lenders. Your bank has, as I said, provided 5 billion euros for new private and public investment. So how does Africa's industrialization agenda fit in with the way that you are looking at investing in the continent?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well now. Is
Perfectly.
That all right? Finally, yes. Good. Okay, very good. And I first wanted to thank you and to have me in this fantastic panel. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you. But let me come to your question. And in a way, it was very good that Acha could speak before me, because, you know, many of the things that he has said, and also Albert, very much resonate with what we are doing. So the EIB, but I see also the other multilateral development banks. We are concentrating, when we are talking about public sector lending, we are concentrating on enabling infrastructure. So it really has to be what will facilitate the private sector activity in the countries. And that's why it is access to markets, it is access to electricity, and it is access to water and sustainable cities. That's in public sector. But let's come to private sector, because that's really what will be the driver. That's what will make the difference. And here at the EIB, we are focusing on 3 industries in Africa where we think there is a very strong chance of having these ones pulling the rest. And these are the health industry, we've talked about it and I'll come back, the green economy, and the third one is digital. On health industry, and actually I was just mentioning it now, the EIB, we're very involved in all the vaccine manufacturing that is happening in Africa, and it's clear that we need to have hubs. It will not make sense to have vaccine manufacturing in many countries. And that's why what we have done is we have listened to the Africa CDC and to WHO, and they have identified where these hubs should be placed. Then every other country can participate in the value chain, because vaccine manufacturing is not just about the plant where the active ingredients are going to be put together and then there is fill and finish. There's a whole value chain behind, and here many other countries can participate. So that was one important point I wanted to mention. And this vaccine manufacturing creates a whole ecosystem of training, of all the quality controls, and this then creates quality jobs that are very important. But beyond vaccine manufacturing in the health sector, there is everything that has to do, and it has been mentioned, with protective equipment, but mainly medicines. We need to have more medicines produced in Africa for the African market. And again, very important, it's not for national country markets, it has to be for sub-regional or the whole continent. And here we have, for example, a facility for active pharmaceutical ingredients, and we're very active in Kenya on this. The minister will be happy to know, because it's important that the active substance is manufactured in Africa, not just that it is, compressed and put in pills and packaged. And in the health sector, let me mention the last one, and it is diagnostics. Because if you cannot test people, you're not going to be treating them early enough and accurately enough in a way that is best for health of the individual, but also for the cost for the system. And in that sense, using the capacities of the private sector is something that will be very important in terms of efficiency. And we have a number of programs where we are right now working with 8 countries in Africa. Kenya is one of them, but there is another 7, where we're looking at what would be the best system to use to harness the efficiencies of the private sector for medical diagnostics. So that's one sector, but I want to come back to the green economy, and in particular to green energy. Here again, the private sector has a major role to play. We have had the scaling solar program of IFC, and now we are working on another one that is more on like technology agnostic, so not only for solar, because there is a major opportunity in terms of renewable energy in Africa. But let me talk about innovations, the innovators in Africa, and in particular green innovators. And very recently, I was participating in the selection of the winners of the Young Talent of the Year as climate innovators. And we really have fantastic youth, men and women. And it's fantastic when I see women in the management of these new companies that are coming up with solutions using renewable energy and solving problems that are specific to Africa and might not happen somewhere else. And I can tell you there was renewable energy used for cooling in the agricultural sector. There was for food trucks, or the food stores on the street. We don't have many of these in Luxembourg, but there are many in the cities in Africa, and you can use renewable energy for those. So supporting these innovators is how we will be supporting youth, and we will be creating jobs that are responding to the needs in Africa. And then digital, of course, essential. So I'll stop here. I see
I'd like you to come back to,
but digital is something is essential here.
Absolutely. And we certainly will be getting back to that point, because that's one of the great questions about the future. But fantastic to hear, what sectors you are focused on, and also that you mentioned the private sector. And it's wonderful to have Jean-Claude on this panel, because I think it's fantastic to be able to hear from someone who's at the coalface, who's got skin in the game. Jean-Claude, based on your experience operating manufacturing facilities on the continent, what is your perception of the narrative in terms of where industrialization is? I mean, you've heard so much from everyone else. It would be interesting to hear what you think as, the person who is doing the manufacturing. where you think the trajectory is and where Africa is now, where it's going in terms of industrialization.
Yeah, I think you can hear me. So basically speaking, it's true that when we see basically speaking Africa and the needs, industrialization is a key factor for all the ecosystem, and I think I fully concord with what has been said. But we do it on purpose because basically speaking, it allows us to have on-site development of innovation, added value that remain in the continent, and to offer in reality to our customer and to the people products made in Africa for African people. And I think this is a key element for us. So in a company as mine, or as many industrial that get as us more than 20 plants in more than 10 countries today. Basically speaking, and come back to Asha, the topic and the problematic we face is a problematic of scale. In many and particularly West African countries, but not only West Africa, the size of each and every market is not big enough to have economy of scale and to have a capacity to have a plan. So we need, clearly speaking, that ACFTA be materialized in the future, because basically today, passing frontiers, the issue of duties that has a big impact on the financing of each and every state has to be solved if we want, at the end of the day, to have a pan-African industrialization. And I think this is a key element for me. The second topic, and this I'm back to a topic that we always have to cope with, is clearly speaking the energy and the capacity also to get stable energy. So I will not comment particular countries, but you all know that in Nigeria, for example, it's a bit complicated, despite the fact that this country has tremendous reserve of oil and gas, and it's true that for an industrial, to have a sustained energy and a capacity to maintain it is a key element. And lastly, and again, you will see the very positive sign just after, but the last element is obviously to have laws that are quite stable on the time. And I think this is very important for investor, that are foreign investor or local investor. If you want to invest in an industry to create jobs, to create an ecosystem, you are here for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And so basically speaking, it's very key also to have a visibility country by country of the capacity. But we are here just to finish. I think the key topic for the industrial and for the private sector is in reality to be much near to our customer base, to be much better adapted to what African customer wants, and to develop in reality innovative product with raw material made in Africa. And I think this is a key element for all of us. It's the reason why Saint-Gobain has so many plans to make. I was coming to what you say about the green economy. We are very involved in the green economy, in all solutions for energy efficiency building. And I think it's better to produce this in Africa than to import it. And I think at the end of the day, this is all about.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Some really, really good insights there. And of course, that perennial problem across the continent. We can't build industrialized nations without the infrastructure. Well, an increasing number of African countries have been developing special economic zone policies as a way to tackle that, and building SEZs in collaboration with internal and external players. So I think it's worth spending some time looking at the potential of SEZs for driving industrial growth in coming years. And to help us with that, I'd like to welcome now Amaury de Feligonde, Managing Partner at Okan. Okan is a strategic consulting and financial firm that's dedicated to Africa, and they've recently prepared a report on SEZs in Africa. So Amaury, we'd love to hear what you've discovered in a few short minutes. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Nancy. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here with you. I've been given 5 minutes, no more, by our friends from the Africa CEO Forum to introduce you to some insights from our last report on special economic zones and their impact on the industrialization of Africa. So I'll give you a few key ideas out of this report, some data also, and I will then let you have a look at this report, which will be released in the coming days. First, these special economic zones, which are now vigorously pushed by so many African countries and governments, are not new. As Nancy was saying as an introduction, they were born mainly in the 80s in China, a not so business-friendly country at that time, and have been the key engines of Chinese economic renaissance. These special economic zones have spread worldwide since then, many emerging countries trying to copy China with various success. Today, there are more than 5,000 special economic zones globally. So why are these SEZ so important for the future of Africa's industry? Because as most of you know, Africa has a tremendous potential in terms of additional transformation of the raw material it exports or it consumes on its own local markets, on mining, on agricultural products, on fish products. Africa also presents in many countries a very complicated doing business environment, as was China 40 years back. African governments have put tremendous efforts in developing SEZ over the last decades. Most of these projects have not been successful and have not been able to slow a strong decline in the share of manufacturing in sub-Saharan Africa's GDP, even if, as Mr. Zefak was saying, that the data is not so clear, we can say that the industrialization of Africa has not been very rapid. Successful SEZ, and there are many of them in all parts of the continent, in Morocco, in Southern Africa, in Eastern Africa, in Madagascar, in Gabon. Successful SEZ show how impactful these projects can be in terms of value creation, transformation of local raw materials, and in terms of job creation. And many of you have been insisting on this very key challenge for Africa, with tens of millions of young African people that will be looking for a job in the coming decades. Our new report, after studying many SEZ projects, and Okan is working with many clients, some of them public, some of them private, on a lot of PPP projects around SEZ also. So studying these SEZ projects, this report has made 6 recommendations for public and private players who are seeking to develop successful SEZ in Africa. First, choose the right suitable location in the country and leverage national resources. Wood in Gabon, cotton in Togo, a key geostrategic position in Tangemed, Morocco. All these raw materials or key success factors, they can be coupled with an abundant workforce which is willing to work and who is willing to be trained. Second, do not make a kind of ghetto of this SEZ and make sure this SEZ is inserted in an overall national development strategy. The Chinese model shows that the SEZ should show the way, be the engines which pulls and transform the rest of the economy. It should not stay a kind of golden enclave in the country. Third recommendation, be customer-centric. Tangemed and its automotive industry work because the big Renault factory has been able to count on 1, an efficient ecosystem of suppliers of first, second, third rank, and 2, on training centers, and 3, on the tremendous logistic system of Tangemed port. Fourth, avoid white elephants. Build in phases. Offer a functional, robust Toyota-style SEZ and not an expensive and hard to maintain kind of Rolls-Royce SEZ for the benefit of your clients. Fifth, establish a fair partnership with the governments, which will lead to the sustainable development of your SEZ in the long run. You don't establish an SEZ for a few years. It includes having a fair tax scheme and can also imply sharing some equity for the state in this SEZ, in PPPs. Last recommendation, and I'll stop here. Make sure your SEZ is sustainable, is green, and is fair. For many people, it's a bit counterintuitive, but targeting the strictest social and environmental standards gives you an edge in the international competition. And it will also help you raising funds to finance this SEZ. So that's a few recommendations that are, of course, developed in this report that will be published in a few days with our partners from Africa CEO Forum. Thank you very much.
Amaury, thank you very much for those insights. Certainly a lot to chew on there. And of course, we have been discussing how different Africa's industrial path could look from Asia. So it's interesting when we talk about SEZs that were a main pillar of that growth in Asia, how they will perform in Africa. Honorable Minor, if I can come to you, back in 2015, Kenya adopted a special economic zone policy as one of its major economic growth and development pillars, aimed at attracting investment to the country's manufacturing center. And at the moment, Kenya does have the highest number of SEZs on the continent, around 61, I believe. I just wonder if you could talk about how successful that policy has been. Is it one that you intend to continue?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, the naming it SEZs in 2015 could be quite misleading because Kenya has been adopting the policy of setting aside specialized areas, lands for development of industries, and we call them export processing zones then. And what they really are is setting aside some land, servicing it, and as Amaury says, ring fencing the business environment within it in order to accelerate investment. And it has worked, but sometimes not as well as we would like it. And I actually quite like one of the points about embedding it in other national policy, because it has been used as space for development and growth of enclave zones, really, for the growth of exports. And the idea that we would like, as we evolve the program, is to ensure that there's a lot more domestic linkages, because quite a few of these EPZs imported raw materials from outside the country, generated jobs and exported products, but we want to use them as scenes for more value addition within the country. But it's a good idea, and I like quite a bit of the results that have come out of it: the number of jobs, the amount of exports. But I think the challenge is if there is inadequate connection and coherence with other national policy, it can do two things. It can breed discomfort and opposition from other manufacturers who are outside the zones because of the superior business environment, and it could actually generate and may lead to absence of political support if there isn't sufficient links with the hinterland. But it's a good idea, and we are happy with the results so far.
That's very interesting what you talk about there in terms of it being integrated with the general fabric of the rest of the economy. and not as Amaury talked of it as a Rolls-Royce SEZ. Those are not the types that seem to work. Jean-Claude, I just wonder, because Amaury's presentation did talk about SEZs being customer-centric, responding to the needs of those people who will actually use the facilities rather than the needs of those who set them up. As a manufacturer, what are some of the policies that you feel African governments can and should employ that would directly address the biggest pain points of manufacturers like you on the continent?
You know, I was commenting before what we definitely need. At the end of the day, an investor and somebody that is putting his money for years in a plant want to have, clearly speaking, potentiality of a market and stability. So I think they are the two main elements. So in the answer, you know, it's the reason why, you know, we are very welcoming the development of a free zone in the years to come, a bit what has been created in Europe, and it took a long time for Europe to make it. But at the end of the day, that allows in reality industrial company to have capacity in reality to offer their services to more people, and at the end of the day to have a scale, as Asha was commenting before. So I think this is the first point that we need. And the second one is, obviously speaking, to have, one more time, stability and a path, a journey, I will say, for the continent, where we want to go in terms, we are talking about, for example, of green economy, construction, allowing in reality people, basically speaking, to go from a poor level with a lot of townships that we have, for example, in South Africa or in many countries, and how do we pull up people in reality to be tomorrow consumers. And I think all that has a big impact. So I think, you know, I think EIB was talking before about the absolute necessity to have a very strong link between the private and the public sector. This is obvious. You know, there is no private investment in a country without good public management also. So I think this is a key element, and I can take many examples. For example, if I come back to the green economy or to the energy efficiency building that I am in, for example, if you don't have a state that wants really to promote, for example, energy transition or to evolve and to sustain it, obviously there is no development of any industry linked to that. So I think we need this type of long-term planning. You know, I think Amaury was talking about China. You know, I've been living in China for 5 or 6 years. I think what also was amazing in this country, later we can critique or whatever we want, but is that there was a plan, basically speaking, of where they wanted to go. And I think this is also what we need, a long-term journey. Sorry, I think this is key.
Fantastic. And you talk there about long-term planning. Asha, let's think about the future for a moment, because while African countries do need to deal with the realities of today, say how to make SEZs that were set up a number of years ago work now, they also have to think about the future of global value chains. As robotics and AI advance, most countries are likely to keep their production processes at home. That may eliminate the need for cheaper labor abroad. AI will create such a shift in how products are manufactured. So if the manufacturing jobs by global entities in that future do not need to be outsourced, some of these expected opportunities that Africa is banking on may not materialize. So when it comes to manufacturing, is Africa's competitor not actually China, but robots and AI? And if that's the case, what type of market should African industries be targeting?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. We've done some analysis, and I think Albert also spoke about it, right? Where you look at manufacturing of the future, and you look at the impact of technology, AI, digitization on all of these supply chains. And a couple of things we found. One is there will be jobs lost, it's very clear, but generally you get more jobs gained. So we actually have a report we put out called Job Lost, Job Gained.
So would that be a net gain or a net?
It'll be a net gain. It'll be net positive, but I'll come back to what it will take to realize it. So if you look at the numbers, take the jobs that you're going to be losing because a lot of it will be automated versus the new jobs you'll be creating in the ecosystem, the net will be positive. Now, what would it take to get there? And we actually did that globally. We also did it for Africa, for South Africa. What it takes is for first with our governments to start to think proactively about what are these new jobs that could be created coming out of the ecosystem, and how do we prepare our people for those jobs, right? So I think that's a fundamental thing. If we don't do that, we'll be caught in the situation where we will lose those jobs, but will not have actually looked for the opportunity to gain the new ones, right? So really being proactive about understanding the implications of this on each of your sectors, on each of our countries, and figure out how do we better position ourselves to be ahead of the curve and prepare, our young, and we have a lot of the youth in Africa for the jobs in the future. That's one thing that's critical, and it's important for our governments to do, and for the private, and to work with the private sector to do that. Now we believe that there are a lot of new jobs, even though these supply chains are disrupted and they'll be shortened, the reality is there will still be some outsourcing. Not everybody will be able to do everything at home, right? And one benefit from the continent is, so again, we have to be proactive in thinking through which are these supply chains, maybe out of Europe, that will shorten and get out of China, and can we integrate the supply chains given proximity, given the distance, given the time zones? Are there supply chains in Europe that we actually can integrate from the continent? So that's the second opportunity I think we have, and we need to think proactively about it. It's not just going to fall on our laps. We need to think proactively about, which countries, which supply chains, what do we do? Why should we be able to integrate? How do we prepare ourselves to integrate in those supply chains? That's the next set of opportunities, I think, coming out of the crisis. And then the third, to your point, again, it's, there are a number of these, as what I talked about from the beginning, of these sectors, supply chains, value chains, where we can actually provide it for the continent. If you look at intra-Africa trade, and we're doing some work now with His Excellency Wankela, the Continental Free Trade Area, looking at sort of private sector strategy. And, again, there's so much more we can do in integrating these supply chains and in providing these products from the continent to the rest of the continent, to other countries. I mentioned 60% of the pharmaceutical products are imported from outside of Africa. How do we then produce it locally and then export to other African countries? Same on vaccines, same on you name it, you name the product, right? So I think the opportunity to say, from a supply chains, how do we integrate into the ones potentially in Europe that are closer, that are pulling out of China? The opportunity to say, how do we start to prepare ourselves for the jobs of the future and prepare our people to fill those jobs and actually provide those jobs globally from here, right? Because a lot of them will still be outsourced. And the opportunity to say, how do we then, through CFTA, really continue to drive intra-Africa trade? All those are massive opportunities for the continent, but we need to be prepared for them.
Again, that point of planning. And while we're thinking about the future, Maria, we're all familiar with the challenges that climate change presents. But does the way that the world is being forced to respond and reconfigure present any opportunities for African industries?
Certainly they do. We need to keep in mind that there is a lot still to be done in Africa in terms of the new infrastructure, the new industries. So we have the opportunity to get it right from the beginning instead of having to try to retrofit, which is much more expensive. I noticed one of the last statements from Amari was that we need to make sure that the special economic zones are green and fair. I would want to say we need to make sure that the industrialization process across the board is green and fair, or in other words, that it is sustainable, that it is resilient, and that it is future-proof. And in this sense, we have mentioned energy efficiency. So it's not only about generating more clean energy, but it's also about being more careful about how we are using the energy that is already generated. Circular economy has been mentioned. Adaptation to climate change. Climate change is here to stay. So we need to make sure that any new infrastructure, any new industry is already taking into consideration this climate change. Because otherwise what we're doing is really making investments that are not going to last long. And here, two more elements. It has to be aligned with customer expectations. And here, like it or not, the customers are now requiring greener products. I was in Côte d'Ivoire last week, and we were talking about the cacao value chain. There is a legislation that is taking shape in the European Union, and the European Union is the biggest importer of cacao from Cote d'Ivoire. And it's a legislation that will prohibit any import of cacao where there is any trace of child labor or of deforestation. So this is really going to have to change the way in which cacao is grown and the whole value chain in Cote d'Ivoire and in other countries. So just to say that this, we will not change it. Young people, consumers, they are expecting that the origin and that there's a traceability, and they're going to be asking questions about how things are produced. And my last point is people-centric. We need to remember that in the end, what we're doing is to serve customers that are people, to give jobs to people, and where the human element is central to everything we want to do.
Fantastic. It's strange how easy it is to forget the human element, even though everything that we do in business, in economy, is actually geared towards improving people's lives. Fantastic. We're going to have to wind this down, but I have one last question for each of you. This panel has been about Africa's economic game plan, and we've talked about many factors that will affect Africa's industrial future, from policy and governance to digitalization and automation, protectionism, climate change. If I were to ask you to pick a single factor that, in your opinion, ranks highest as one that will have the largest effect on the trajectory of Africa's industries, what would it be? If I can get each of you to just give me a very quick, short answer to that, that would be fabulous. We'll start with you, Honorable Minor. What is the one thing you think will have the biggest impact on Africa's industrial future?
One or two things. I think the big one is, for me, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, because Africa imports many things that it can actually manufacture. So making the Africa Continental Free Trade Area work, it's not just a question of elimination of the tariffs. It's going to take infrastructure and connectivity between the countries. It's going to take trade facilitation, because it's easier to move goods from Nairobi to the UK by boat many times than it is to move them to Congo or Angola in the same manner, because of the trade facilitation. So we need to make it possible to trade amongst ourselves, because studies, including from the UNECA, have shown us that there is great possibility for trade creation by the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Secondly, the proper focus on digital is important. We can't escape the internet, and I like what Albert said, that we can't just talk about the Internet of Things, but we also need to talk about making the things that we use in the Internet of Things. But there's a lot of our young people are very innovative in this space, and there's great possibility to scale that up significantly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jean-Claude, what would be your one factor?
I think, again, I will make two very quick. Localization policy by the state, I think, is important in reality to favor to be proud. There is a proudly SA, for example, in South Africa. I think is a key factor to make the customers and the supplier proud of a local made product. And second one, to improve logistics between countries. We didn't discuss about that much, but the logistics, you are talking of infrastructures, the way to pass frontier, again, to get a scale. I think this is the two elements for me.
Fantastic. Maria, what's your factor?
What I would say is that sustainability is the only viable road. So whatever we do, we need to think of the current generations, but also of the generations of the future.
Short and sweet and to the point. It's certainly a very good one there. Ashaleke.
For me, it's very clear. It's execution. I think, everything we spoke about today, I don't think was that new, honestly. I think we could talk about differently. But, where we fail as a continent is executing all of this, right? We know the policies, we know what needs to be done. We have the visions, we have the strategies. Where we fall short is in execution. So for me, it's about what's it going to take to execute. And what that's going to take for me is leadership. Where the continent has failed today is we have a big leadership problem. How do we get more, leaders at the top and in industrial ministry sectors? How do we get more honorable miners across the continent who are going to make it happen? That's what we need.
Very well said. It's okay to have a plan, but that plan must survive contact with reality, or at least come into contact with reality. Thank you so much to the panel. You've underscored really that despite the pandemic and other challenges, industrialization prospects in Africa do remain positive, which is, of course, good news. With the right decisive actions, Africa could even follow a greener path to prosperity, building a low-carbon manufacturing sector from the ground up. And I do think that if there ever was an opportunity to step back and rethink growth on the continent through a sustainable mindset, as Maria reminded us, this is that moment. A big thank you to you, our panel, for helping us today see the vast possibilities of the future. And my thanks to you watching for your time and attention. Goodbye.